Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Corda. I'm the Director of Business Development at the Tech Collective. We're very pleased to have you here for our presentation of cyber agility and resiliency, leading with a framework in mind. We're thrilled to have Mary Sharif, who is a security architect at Cisco, present today. Having been through the dry run, this is going to be a pretty intense presentation with a lot of information coming at you. We're grateful to Donna from Vertical 6 who put together this presentation. So just briefly, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Tech Collective is the IT Industry Association for the state of Rhode Island. We put together programs like this to bring you the best of the best information to help you make good decisions in your businesses as well as your careers, as well as trainings to help you move along and help your people be trained. We're a member organization and we look forward to having you here today for this. I know Mary has this chock full, so I am going to hand over the reins to you, Mary, so that the people can get really what they came for today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Mary Sharif. Just hopefully today we'll go through some content that you're going to find useful and be able to use in your organizations. Today's topic is how to use the framework to achieve cyber agility and resiliency. We could literally spend hours on this topic and we'll still have more to discuss. But since we only have half an hour, there are three key takeaways that I would really like you to walk away with. And those are: cyber risk is best managed through adopting a framework. Governance and executive sponsorships are key elements of a successful security program. Policies are basic and fundamental. They provide the structure upon which your program should be built on. And I always really like to start with the Dunning-Kruger effect. It really holds true. So most people, when they're first introduced to compliance policies and frameworks, their initial response is, well, how hard can this be? I think I kind of know a lot, right? With just a glimpse of it, they're like, wow, that makes sense. It's common sense. I know a lot. And then as they get into really working in it, they're like, well, it's a lot more than I thought. And then once you introduce them to the next 853, they're like, well, I am never really going to understand this at all. As they start to implement some controls and get their feet wet, then they're like, well, it starts to make sense, right? And anyone coming up to them and asking questions about compliance or risk management thereafter, they're like, well, trust me, it's complicated. And you know what? It really is. And that's why a lot of times when you speak with engineers and with risk managers, when you ask them a question, they're like, well, it depends. And so the reason that people say that is because their field in this space and this knowledge has grown, and they know that there's so many variables to take into consideration before you can really respond to a given situation or a question. And so if somebody responds to your question as, well, it depends, don't get frustrated. It is quite possible that you're in the presence of somebody who has in-depth knowledge. So what is our problem statements? Why do we need a program in order to manage risk at an organization? This should really sound familiar to all of you. 90% of the surveyed organizations, they don't know what is connected to their environment. So they do not have a proper network access control or network inventory of everything that is connected in their environments. And then visibility. For those of you who have regulatory requirements and your data is encrypted, visibility is a lot harder, right? So 40% of the organizations don't have proper visibility. And then 85% of the organizations, they have someone in their environment and they have no idea. So these problems are not new. And the scary thing about these problems are that we used to have them when our parameter was defined, when our users and devices were designated a location, which is quite drastically different from today, right? Where is our parameter today? Our users could be working from anywhere. And in terms of what is connected to our network, well, that exploded, right? With bring your own device and IoT and on and on. So the attack surface has expanded. Our business requirements have changed, especially since COVID. And this will continue to change. And on the opposite end, we have adversaries that are skillful, they're resourceful, and guess what? They use machine learning and scale their multi-vector attacks and pretty motivated, to get to our assets, be it student data, patient data, financial or intellectual property data. And the problem is that they need to get it only once against a target. We have to get it right every time against all adversaries. So our work is cut out for us. And if we don't approach, going after this and making sure that we have our arms around this, we need to be a little methodical too. And that's why we should be really using a framework to do that and have a program. So exactly what do I mean when I see a framework? There's a little bit of a confusion out there between frameworks and regulations and what they are. So a well-known framework in the US is NIST, and the most comprehensive NIST publication is 853. There are other publications that are also followed a lot, 871, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which kind of uses a subset of controls from the 853. There are hundreds of controls under 853, especially if you get the sub-controls, it just becomes quite a lot. So I was talking about using frameworks programmatically. It is really based on the concept shown on the management framework here, which is 837. It's an iterative, cyclical, continuous model, which you can use to build your program. It kind of starts with categorizing, then you select your controls, you implement those, you assess them, you authorize them, and you monitor them. And the great thing about this is that there's publications out there to kind of show you how to categorize your data. That is the FIPS 199 and the 860. Then you select them and so on. So this becomes an iterative model. You could use something like Deming, right? The Deming model, plan, do, check, act, in terms of putting this inside of the Deming model. So you're continuously building maturity as you update for change, as you mature it based on, okay, I'm here now, the next wave of investments will take me to the next level. So as you move further along in your targeted state, this can really help you. So there are a lot of other frameworks. My favorite one is Xerotrust. And I really like this framework, and you're probably familiar with it. It's because it's not so very complex. Where NIST is vast and requires a deep understanding of controls and implementation of the same, I think Xerotrust is an easier concept to understand, implement, and quantify. There are obviously other frameworks as well. I just wanted to also draw your attention to the relationship between frameworks and regulation, where PCI is a standard, HIPAA and CJIS are regulatory requirements. And depending on the kind of organization that you have, you probably have quite a few to adhere to. And here we're trying to capture that, whether you're in education or government or healthcare, you have tons and tons of regulatory requirements. And if you're not adopting a framework, investments are often made based on technical approach then, right? Resulting in gaps that does not support a defense in depth approach. The people element is disjointed. We often see security ops, network ops, and IT ops. They don't really work together, and they don't drive their requirements for investment as a team. And governance is often lacking, which means there is lack of policies and accountability. So managing risk this way gets really expensive and puts further strain on the already scarce resource of people, money, and time. This is just a reference slide. Now, I was talking if we had 2 hours, we could go through all of this, and it would be fun. But I want to call out SANS Top 20 in terms of organizations that do not have a good posture on security yet. Though that's like the low-hanging fruit, right? That's where we need to start. We need to have a model that is easy to understand and implement. And so if you do not have a team of people that is supporting this effort, that's probably a framework to look at. And then Xerotrust, like I said, is really interesting. And I'm going to dive dive a little deeper both on Xerotrust and the NIST Cybersecurity framework, because I think those are the buzzwords you're hearing, but honestly, Xerotrust is pretty exciting. So Xerotrust, from the Office of Management and Budget and the CIO of Council perspective, has given their view of what it is. If I were to summarize the slide, to me, Xerotrust is not a sprint, it is a journey. Your existing investments should lend itself to this journey. So bring in your capabilities. So for example, if you have a two-factor authentication solution today in place, that lends itself to Xerotrust. If you have measures that is protecting your workloads, whether on-prem and cloud, then that lends itself to this model. And so you map those against the desired state. And if you're a Nest shop, you could use NIST 800-207, which guides this adoption of Xerotrust as well. So the good thing about Xerotrust is really centered around the concept of protecting data, your crown jewels, and building on protecting layers from unauthorized or excessive access by those that are authorized to the data. And your goal is always to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability to those users and systems that are authorized. And it should be role-based with least privilege. So given that wherever the data may be, whether it's in motion or at rest in any environment, on cloud, on-prem, it should have the full protection of confidentiality and integrity, and be accessible and available. So one thing you remember about Xerotrust today is that trust absolutely no one and verify everyone, and have a continuous verification model. So that is basically the gist of it. You know how we're always used to trust but verify? Well, you don't trust and you still verify. So let's talk a little bit about NIST. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with NIST, and hopefully most of you use NIST cybersecurity framework to communicate risk to the executives and data owners as you work to secure funding and sponsorship. I talked a little bit about in the beginning of the presentation that you make sure that you have governance and that you make sure you have a sponsorship and funding. So if you don't have that, you can't really further your program much. And I've seen this time and time again where we as custodians go in front of the owners and we talk about very granular or at a level where it just does not resonate with our business partners, right? And so how do we exactly communicate? Don't talk about the categories, right? Because you lose them. If you summarize it and you take all of your current capabilities, create a pie chart against them, and you show them, in the area of, for example, you don't go into identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover and get into the categories. But if you say, in terms of what we have in our environment, we only have, 90% or 95% visibility, which poses this risk. And at the end, if breached, these systems could end up doing X, or this is basically your risk. Same thing around protection. For those areas that we have put in, controls that is going to provide the protection against a breach, we still have a gap that basically will result in this kind of exposure. Are you willing to take that risk? And by the way, it also is against our regulatory requirements for HIPAA and PCI or something. That is the way that they will understand. And oftentimes I see organizations really, really investing a lot in identify, protect, and detect. They really believe that if they put that in there, they don't really need to have much in terms of respond and recover. And so they don't have the right relationships. They don't have the their incident response playbook, if you will, in place. And things get outdated. It's not always kept up to date, and they don't do table topics on it, and they don't run the program adequately. And then after something happens, there is that recover phase where things need to be really looked at and documented, and then changes needed to be made. And that's why a framework is important. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, NIST is not just about technology, which when I said if you don't follow a framework, it's really a technical approach. Technical approach meaning that you're going to go buy a technology, you're going to implement it, and it's going to run in your environment. trust me, if you don't have a policy behind it, if you don't have people and process behind it, that technology implementation goes south or does not reach its optimum implementation. It will not integrate. It will not show you the gaps that it's filling or the gaps that is there afterwards. And obviously, there is a lot of overlap. Most organizations buy a lot of technology, and their people are focused just around the implementation without a formal process. So that is a huge problem. Because what does this look like? Every technology has the people process element to it. Not every people process element has a technology behind it. So what you should be really thinking about is, how do I run this process, this business requirement, in terms of an IT solution manually? What would that look like? And then you buy a technology that best aligns with the process that works in your organization. And then your implementations will go a lot better. So within the framework, the identify portion refers to the governance controls. I urge you to take a look at the governance model in your organization and document and understand it. Use the definitions to see if you can draw parallels between the governance, what governance means in your organization, and how the framework defines it. Use the informative reference. Walk it back to the NIST 853 PM controls to basically gauge how you perform against it. At the end of the day, the NIST 853 PM controls is not a checklist. It is a guidance. Not everything is going to, align with what you need for your organization, but it is really a good start. And it goes back to the idea of due diligence and due care. And if you don't have that, and you have these policies that are just there and people are not following it, it's hard to enforce and show due diligence. If something happens, you have a breach, somebody sues you, it's hard to prove due diligence and due care. So why would you want to go through all this, right? The reason is you want to do it is because of these outcomes. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but provide a strategic direction and support. Imagine if you don't have this, if you don't have the strategic direction and support from upper management, from the C-level, the owners, exactly how are you going to implement, right? And if you have governance, then you will have that guidance. Integration and synergy. There is the concept of inheritance. And if you have policies, you know what requirements you have, you look through the different regulations, and we will talk about what makes up a policy. And so when you create a list of everything in terms of your requirements, you will find that there are common controls that can cover multiple requirements. And so you can segment that section, and you can put like controls, common controls, and then once you implement it, it covers a whole lot of requirements, and that reduces duplication, right? You don't want to do the same thing over and over again in different segments. You want to kind of put those in an enclave, if you will. And improve communication. You will know what to communicate about to begin with, and you can quantify it. So one thing I see time and time again, and I alluded to it in the first slide, automate and maximize visibility and risk mitigation. You are not going to believe how many times you go in front of customers and talk about automation, and people think this is a job security issue. Well, when hackers are automating and using machine learning, and there is 50,000 ways for someone to get into your environment, and you're not using automation and visibility, and you still are doing manual things, that we didn't, like I said, we didn't solve these issues of lack of visibility when our environments were simple. Imagine doing that today without automation. It's impossible. So understand how automation can really help you get to that next level. So if governance isn't in place, referring back to the NIST PM controls, you will have policies against the family of controls that meet the requirements for your organization. So exactly what drives requirements? So if you have a policy from your CISO's office, or you're the CISO, and you do not align your policies to the mission, objective, values, and strategies of the organization, then you're going to have a problem securing funding, right? And you are actually not going to even meet the requirements of the executives and the owners. So it better be aligned with the mission and objectives of the organization. Otherwise, you are going to miss delivering outcomes, business outcomes that could be the key differentiator for your organization in terms of the core competency of what your business does. Security is huge. And if you don't have the trust of your customers and your stakeholders for the services that you provide, then you don't have credibility, and it's not going to go well. Same thing with stakeholders and their requirements. So let's say that within your organization, there is a team that goes after a project with Department of Defense, and they have to meet the famous CMMC, right, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. If you don't know their requirements and you don't include that as part of what you need to do, they will lose the funding, right? Because this is a certifiable thing. If you don't certify against the CMMC, you're not going to even get the project to begin with. And so requirements from stakeholders are pretty important. And then the regulatory requirements. Nothing you can do about these to transfer them out or ignore them or avoid them. If you have regulatory requirements, you cannot really contract it out. A lot of people with PCI as a standard, right, you can do that. But in terms of HIPAA, or if you have CGIS or FERPA or FISMA or PUP 1075, you're not going to be able to extend that out. And then there is the legal and contractual requirement. Contractual requirements are important that NIST actually updated their framework in order to include third-party contracts. And if you run into these, and if you don't consider this as part of what you need to do for your policies, you could easily get sued. You could have all kinds of issues. And I have worked with organizations that they don't really have good security policies, or their security policies are copy-pasted, or they just write this big, huge policy that is supposed to do everything. And they don't have the systems or the processes to support it. So when they conduct a risk assessment, what exactly is the risk assessment against? If it's not against the mission of your organization, the state requirements from your stakeholders, the regulatory requirements, the legal and contractual requirements, if you are assessing against a framework, you're wasting a lot of money. And at the end, you're still not going to come up with a gaps report that is going to show your gaps. Because going against and doing it against a framework like 853, that's insane, right? There's just so many different controls in that. So you want to make sure that it's kind of a subset of that, an overlay of that really meets against your policies and your requirements. So where do you start? Start asking yourself a question. Is my data classified? I know it always comes to this first, right? And people are like, I don't need to do that because in my data center and the way my network is set, that level of classification cannot really be walked through, right? But even if whatever that means for your organization, based on how you want to do, how you want to set up your network, or what you can afford with a change, it may just be your data is classified in 2 ways: internal, external. Level of high confidentiality, and then everything is open access. I don't know what that looks like for you. But at the end of the day, once you have it classified, you should be able to determine that these are my crown jewels, and this is the data that should not have unauthorized access to it, and it should always maintain CIA. So, and then you assess the controls around it. Is this public facing? Does it have regulatory requirements running through its veins? Do I have a gap in this? And you work through that. So taking it from a requirement to a control. So HIPAA is a requirement, you write policies against it. Then you look at the framework and you say, well, this is not all of HIPAA, right? I'm just pointing out a section of HIPAA. And then these are the controls that you would implement in order to meet the requirement for HIPAA. This is just a reference slide, really. This is a really, really powerful slide, and I hope you walk away with a good understanding of this. So if you have adopted a framework, and if you do a cross-mapping of other frameworks, consider like adding MITRE ATT&CK or MITRE and MITRE SHIELD, and continue to build on that to do some mapping on the solutions you have purchased. Now you have a holistic view of what is going on. So when I say you've already adopted a framework such as SANS Top 20, or you have NIST 53 or ISO or whatever, if you look at it, it extends itself to other regulatory other frameworks as well. So for example, I am an ISO lead implementer, but I can tell you I can go to NIST, and I have worked with NIST a lot more than I've worked with ISO. And there's a direct correlation between the two, alignment between the two. So if you can do one, you can do all. And so that's the idea. And then look at the HIPAA requirements. That also meets the requirement for PCI, as it refers to the Identification Asset Management -1. So if you have a stringent requirements such as HIPAA or CGIS or FISMA, then what happens is when you implement one, you pretty much get the benefit of meeting your other requirements to the tune of about 80%, if not more. And so that's where it becomes powerful. And when I was talking about duplication, what if you were doing this separately, different organization, different part of the organization does HIPAA and somebody else does PCI? You could really be, investing a lot of money in things that you don't have a good visibility, that that you already have this control implemented in certain part of your environment. And what if you were to enclave those together or segment those together? Or use the same technology you have invested to make sure that it extends to the other. So this is where it really, the power of inheritance and auditability of your system gets a lot easier. And when we talk about, lack of frameworks is extensive, this is exactly what I'm talking and referring to. So policies are C-level requirements in terms of what they bring to the table and what their requirements are. Standards are managers' formal requirements that align with one or more C-level policies. Procedures are the steps to execute a standard, and guidelines, although are not required, they're industry recommendation for standards, and many organizations end up converting guidelines into policies and standards. So we started our session with the idea that through adoption of a framework, we can build security programs that offer agility and resiliency. Throughout the presentation, we talked about proper governance, which if in place, would have the right policies that are tied to your organization's vision and mission, your stakeholders' requirements, as well as your legal and contractual. You use a management framework that we talked about in slide 4, where you categorize, select, implement, assess, and authorize, as well as monitor your controls based on your policies. You create a repeatable process, because if it's not repeatable, you cannot really mature it. And so use a model that's such as Deming to do plan, do, check, and act to continuously improve and tune your program. You conduct risk assessments against your policies and your program. And that's where your systems are going to be able to take the change that you need to do. If a new requirement comes out and you have no idea how to update that requirement, then you're probably not using a framework and you're probably not doing it programmatically. And that's what brings in agility and resiliency, is when you're able to make changes to your framework without having to spend hours and tons of resources to understand how that happens. PCI, when they made the requirement for two-factor authentication across everything, right? If you had a program and you were doing a two-factor authentication, and for another part of your organization, for CGIS, for example, you could easily translate that and bring it over and add those controls to the segment where you were doing PCI. And that's what I'm talking about when I say agility and resiliency. And when your business requirements change, that change is easy to implement. So the new components are easier to add and delete. Because there are times when you will see, this control that I've implemented is no longer adequate, or it doesn't do, or does not have the effect that I needed to have. So responding to change is what is really going to help you, in terms of having a program and managing the resources needed in order to manage the change. So I hope you're a believer that cybersecurity, at least now you're a believer, that cybersecurity is best managed through adopting a framework. Governance and executive sponsorships are key elements of a successful security program, and policies are basic and fundamental. They provide the structure upon which you build your program, and I wish you good luck in your journey to adopting a framework and maturing your security programs. With that, I give it back to Monica. Monica, do I have any questions?
Let's see. Question for Mary. As a small business, what is the best way to start CCMC NIST 800-171 self-assessment is very vague and doesn't apply to a small business. How would a small business start for CCMC?
I would start by documenting your current processes. What are you doing today? How are you managing? And obviously the CCMC is against 171. And so NIST 800-171. So I would start with that and start documenting. Do not pay money to go get risk assessment if you don't know what your current environment is to begin with. Understand the gaps first. Try to make changes. And once you have implemented those changes, that's when you go and get a risk assessment to see if it basically moved the needle for you. But I would caution everyone from going and just doing risk assessments without doing your own due diligence, because in my experience, I was the director of compliance for the state of New York. And, what I learned in my journey in there is that we paid multi-million-dollar contract with a very, very, one of the top 5, right? And they came and did this extensive risk assessment, and the risk assessment was great. It was great company and great work that they did. But you know what? We didn't really learn anything new. We already knew everything that was on there. And so the idea is document your current environment, put in the controls, and use NIST to really go and do the assessment as well.
Super. Sejan, I hope that answered your question. If anyone else has a question, if they want to type it into the chat, please. Don't until I see something. I'll just say thank you, Mary, so much for sharing such a large body of knowledge with this community in such a very short amount of time. And thank you to Talia, also from Cisco, to Creosa, who put it all together from the Tech Collective side, and to Jana from Vertical 6, who was kind enough to put us in touch with Mary and get her here today. So I do not see anything else listed in the chat, Mary. So I'll just say that the next event is coming up on the 29th of September. It is CIS Top 20 Data Recovery Capabilities. It's Dan Shackleton from Vertical 6 will be presenting on that as well. So we look forward to seeing you all in the future, and we hope that this information has given you a lot to think about for the rest of your day. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I do want to close with one last thing from the Cisco's perspective. Our security solutions, we're the biggest vendor of security solutions in the market, and our solutions do align to the NIST cybersecurity framework and all Xerotrust. In fact, Forrester has named us as a leader in the Xerotrust strategy and framework. So please reach out to us, reach out to Talia, reach out to myself, and don't forget to go on LinkedIn and just send me a note. Love to hear from you. So take a look and ask your account managers from Cisco, your partners at Cisco, or the Cisco partners that you work with, such as Vertical 6, and see how we can help. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.